We have this bathroom in our basement, and this is about what it looked like when we bought the house in 2009, I think. I think there was a little more to the light fixture. I think I'd taken that down by the time I took this picture. But this was the original bathroom. This was the shower. It looks like someone tiled the inside of the shower, but then never got to the outside. It was sort of unfinished. And there was this sort of green masonite board on everything. So we've been slowly working on this bathroom over the last 10 years or so. We figured we'd take out the light that was in the ceiling and the sink. It was just sort of a cheap particle board cabinet with a sink in it. It just was a matter of giving it a little help with the crowbar. And the sink was sort of a one-piece formed plastic sink. It wasn't as nice as it looks here.
Looks like someone used glue.
Yeah, it was just glued on with caulk, I think. There were no screws or anything. You can tell this is a long time ago because the kids were still kids. And I took the cabinet apart. That was fairly easy. I don't know that I really saved any of this. It was all cheap particle board, so it wasn't really anything worth doing another project with. And the kids inspected again. So by the size of the kids, this must have been a couple of years after we moved in. Maybe 3 or 4 years after we moved in. You can see on the far wall there's a big piece of sort of yellow plywood. I think the color originally might have been yellow. I think there was a mirror hanging on that wall when we first moved in. And behind that piece of plywood is the hot water heater. I removed the green paneling that was in the bathroom, and it had been glued up with this sort of black, very hard glue. So after the demo work, you can see what the bathroom looked like. So this was several years ago. And I decided to remove a lot of the drywall that had the black glue on it. And I took the ceiling down as well. You can see the hot water heater now with that piece of plywood removed. And we ended up redoing the floor. All the power also comes down with all the plumbing behind the sink. The sill that sits on top of the foundation wall under the window was kind of rotting away, so I took that out. I did plaster the foundation wall. I never got any video of that or any time lapse. It looks the same as the plastering I did in the craft room. The big boss came in to inspect. I put new drywall. I think this is green board, so it takes water a little better. And then we skip ahead a few years. So I've plastered that wall below the window, and I've put up all the drywall and painted. And it has sat like this for quite some time. When we had the kitchen redone and the plumbing work for the kitchen done, we had the plumber also put the fixtures back in this basement. So it's been a functional bathroom for the last 5 years or so. So the first sort of somewhat simple project I wanted to do was to make a nice sill under the window that would cap the foundation wall. Because the foundation wall is concrete, I can't just screw or nail into it very easily. So my thought was to make a piece of blocking that would sit on top of the foundation. And I kind of took down some of the higher spots on the foundation top, as they hadn't really ever smoothed this out. It was just sort of the lumpy top of the concrete pour. I didn't spend too much time on this. I made this piece of blocking that would fit on top of the foundation wall, and I would screw that into the sill plate that sits under the window, the bottom piece to the wall, which is wood. I cut it to the right length, and I could put it in place and then check the width. And I cut the width to the right size that I would need. What I'm going to do is use pocket screws to screw this piece of blocking horizontally into the sill plate under the window. And I shimmed it into the location that I wanted. then I could put the screws in. And this actually worked pretty well. And what this gives me is a sort of a substrate that I can attach the finished piece of the sill to. So I'm going to make an L-shaped piece in section that's as long as the wall is. And I took the measurements I needed, and I have a 1/2-inch piece of maple I'm going to use. I can cut that to close to the length, joint an edge, then cut a 45-degree angle into the length of this piece. Now I can make a long miter joint along the L of this cap piece. I can glue and nail the two sides together, which was a little tricky, but it worked. Some of the spots didn't quite go together, so I was trying to clamp them a little tighter. Then I cut this piece to the final length. I set up my miter saw outside so it would be closer to the bathroom, so I wouldn't have to go quite as far to make these kinds of cuts. Then when it was all ready, I put polyurethane on it. I figured it needed a little bit of durability. And for some reason, I didn't get any video of putting this piece in, which was kind of the whole point. But it went in just fine. It fit under the window. I used 2 finish nails to hold it in place. The bigger project in this bathroom was to build some kind of cabinetry that would fit around the water heater. There's a space next to the water heater that I wanted to use, and I thought we could get a little bit of storage out of that. And I could make a nicer cover for the water heater. I took some measurements to figure out what I had to work with. I could make a set of cubbies about 1 foot wide and about 2 feet deep. When the water heater was put in, the plumber put I'm not exactly sure what this pipe is called. It's sort of an overflow for the water heater, and it goes outside. It's not usually full of water, but it needs to be there so we don't get a flood in the basement. When it was put in right across the space that I wanted to use for my cabinet. So I wanted to move this pipe up a little bit. So I cut off the pipe where it was, and I moved a piece of the pipe from one side to the other side, and then I could reattach the pipe higher up in the space, so it would be a little more out of the way. When I went to get the glue and the connectors that I was going to need for this, I actually found and had a long talk with one of the salespeople at one of the big box hardware stores, which is kind of rare, but he talked my ear off and he knew all about what I was trying to do. So he got me the right kind of glue and the right size connector pieces. Once the pipe was moved, I could start working on the cabinet. The first thing to make was a base on the floor for the cabinet to sit on, as I wanted it raised up a little bit. I think it was 5.5 inches. So I made a little frame, and after trying to figure out what I was trying to do, I decided I needed to attach a 2x4 piece to the wall. Then I could attach my rectangular piece to that 2x4. And I could attach another piece to that rectangle that would hold the base frame around the bottom of the cabinet. So I attached my rectangular piece together. And I put the screws in that I would need to hold this to the piece that's attached to the wall. And then it was ready to go inside. And you can see how that's going to fit in. And when I got it in just the right location, I could put the screws in. Then I could attach the third piece along the front. And this will hold the baseboard. And the foundation is ready. I can start cutting the sheets for the actual cubbies. It'll be fairly simple. It's 2 sides with dados and 5 shelves, so 6 pieces that'll run between those 2 sides, and then a back. I'm cutting the shelf pieces here. And I'm going to try something I've never done before, which is to use this stick-on edge banding. I looked at the iron that we have, and I decided it was too nice to use in the shop. So I went to Goodwill, and I found a selection of used ones. So I picked one up for $7. I don't have to worry about getting glue on it and keeping it nice. So with this edge banding, it's a little bit wider than the plywood. Then the idea is to cut off the extra bit and get it nice and flush. I tried sanding it, and that worked, but it took a while. So I ended up cutting off that extra bit with a razor. So I did the fronts on the shelves and then one side of each of the side pieces. So this will have the edge banding on the front face of the cubbies. And I did the edge banding before I cut the dados. So the dado will be cut into the edge banding. In the end, I had trim over the sides, so I really didn't need the edge banding on these long sides. Then I figured out where to cut the dados. So I think I have 5 shelves, which makes 4 shelf pieces and a top and bottom, so 6 pieces that are the same. I laid them out evenly across the height. So what I figured out pretty quickly is I could run the 4 dados that are near the top and the bottom all with the fence in the same location. Then I can move the fence and do the 4 inner dados all with the fence in the same place. This made cutting the dados pretty straightforward. Then I cut the ravets on each end. They're the same width and the same depth. Then I cut the shelf pieces to the final length and all exactly the same. I cut a piece for the back. I found a leftover piece of 1/2 inch birch plywood that would work for this. I had always imagined that I was going to glue all of these dado connections, but what I realized when I was starting to set this up was that you're never going to see the outside of this cabinet. So I can just put everything together with screws, which isn't necessarily better, but it's just less stressful. This would be a lot of dados to do all at once and fast enough that the glue doesn't set up too quickly. So with screws, I can just clamp it together and then just put all the screws in on one side and flip it over and do all the screws on the other side. So it actually probably took longer, but it was just easier. And I screwed the back on. And I flush trimmed the back, which I also really didn't need to do, but I just felt like I should. I could just see getting it in place, and the little bit of overhang on the back is in the way somewhere, and I have to bring the whole thing back out to the shop and flush trim it anyway, so I figured I would just do it while it was out here. I can bring it in the house and bring it in the bathroom and see if it fits. And I'm glad I measured 27 times, so I didn't build this too big. And it fit right in there, perfect. And it fit under the pipe that I moved. So in looking at it, I thought I could attach it to the house with pocket screws. So I'm going to put a pocket screw at the top corner and a second pocket screw at the bottom corner. And that should be okay. Since it's sitting on the base that I made, the screws are just there to keep it from sliding around. I shimmed it into the exact location that I wanted it, so everything was flush, and I put the pocket screws in. This one on the top I had to put in at a little bit of an angle because the drill wouldn't fit under the shelf that's above the cabinet. And I put a little shim piece at the corner, so the dimension against the wall would be the same. And it's pretty close to vertical. I pretty much figure working on old houses that nothing is square, nothing is vertical. Everything is about finding where to hide the slop. And I put the a screw in the bottom. It seems solid. I can make the baseboard now. When I was making this, I was thinking I would make a piece that would sit in front of my frame that I made, and you'd see the top of this. So I used a scrap piece of wood for the bottom, and I glued a nice piece of maple to the top. And then I figured the white baseboard that I was going to put in the bathroom was going to cover this. So I wasn't really concerned that it was two pieces. I was just trying to save some of the maple. I think I was using a scrap piece of maple, and that's how wide it was. So I cut it down to size. And in the end, I ended up running out of the white baseboard, and I kind of liked it as wood anyways. I'm not going to cover up that scrap piece at the bottom. I suppose at some point in the future I could put a piece of maple over the whole thing. Then I started working on the trim that's going to cover the rest of the cabinet, make a frame for the doors up above, and a frame for the door that's going to cover the hot water heater. And when I was thinking about this, I thought I was going to do it as separate pieces of trim and just do it like I'm putting trim on a house. But then I remembered, no, the way you do this is you make a face frame and you put the whole frame over the whole assembly at once. And that allows you to get the joints nice and tight between the pieces. And it's all nice and square and nice and flat. The variation ends up in the back where you don't see it. So I made a complete face frame and then attached that over the cabinet and the frame of the opening in the house. And this worked really well. I probably should have made the piece on the cabinet next to the door a little bit wider because you can see the edge of the cubbies. And I did add one piece of trim along the other side of the cubbies. This will be the side for the hinges on the big door to the hot water heater. Now that the cabinetry is done, I can start working on the trim for the bathroom. This is the trim that goes around the doors. And I got some poplar that I plan to just paint. We got some glossier white paint for this trim. So I cut these pieces down to the sizes I would need. Most of the pieces were straightforward, but there's one at the second door where the door is right next to the corner, and I wanted to scribe that width, as it also varied. It was wider at the top than it was at the bottom. Then I cut that piece on the bandsaw following that line, and I got sort of a long wedge shaped that'll be that piece of trim in the corner. Then I sanded and painted all these pieces so they're the right section dimension, but they're a little long at this point. So I'll paint them, then cut them to length and put them in place. And I only painted the sides that you're going to see. Now that the paint's dry, I can cut the pieces to the lengths I'll need. And I did them one at a time. I'd measure a piece, cut it, put it in place, and then do the next piece. So I started with a piece in the other corner to the scribed corner. And this one is the door frame, and then it's also the trim covering the end of the new cabinet. So I have it running from the floor to the ceiling. Once that's in place, I can do the two pieces on the other side of that same door. And I'll miter the corner at the top. And there's a piece that goes along the top of the new cabinet frame. So I'm going to continue that long piece along the wall up across the ceiling. And that'll cover that gap in the ceiling. And I had to be careful where the nails went. I had marks on the ceiling so that they would go into the floor joists and not hit the ductwork. Then the long skinny piece that I scribed, that fit nicely. And then I can do the miter cuts for the other side of that door. Those went in nicely. Then I started working on the baseboard. When we first moved into the house, we had the new floors put in, and we had new baseboard put in. and I saved some of the extra baseboard, and I've been saving it all this time to use in this bathroom. And a nice long piece I could put along the long foundation wall. And the foundation wall being concrete, I don't really have an easy way to attach the baseboard with fasteners to the concrete, so I just glued it in place. My way of putting a little pressure on the baseboard with a glue setup was to use some weights and have the weight sort of rolling into the baseboard and holding it in place. So there's a weight on the floor that stays in place pretty well because the floor is sort of a rubbery material. The vertical weight sort of is falling towards the baseboard and holds it in place. Then I did the baseboard around the shower. And I'd always wondered about how to redo this shower face, whether I should tile it or do something nicer, but I ended up just putting this same kind of trim around the door, and it seems to work pretty well. Then I put caulk in all of the joints in the trim and baseboard that I put up, just to kind of clean everything up so those gaps go away. And then I'll paint over the caulk and it'll all kind of disappear. I did the window. We're going to have to, I think, take that window pane out and clean it all up and repaint it. That's sort of the last little thing I think that isn't quite finished yet in the bathroom. I wanted to get the caulk in the joint around the shower really well, as that's where the water is. And I went around with a sponge and cleaned up all the extra bits of caulk, getting it off the tile and the wood in a couple of places. Then I put polyurethane on the trim and the face frame on the cabinetry. Probably should have done this in the shop, but it doesn't really matter. And we just ordered and I put in a vent cover in the ceiling, as we have one vent. I figured at some point, if I want to make a nice wood one, I can do that in the future. But for now, I just took the easy route on the vent cover. The last big thing is to make the doors that go in the cabinetry. So I need two smaller doors that go up above on the shelf and a big door to cover the hot water heater. These are the two little doors. The two little doors are square. As their frame I made as part of the face frame, it's fairly square. But the big door is not square. I figured out that one of the corners is a 90-degree angle, but the top and bottom dimension are different. The bottom is a little bit less than the top. So I had to cut off a sliver of that door. And I decided the easiest way to do it was to make sort of a simple track saw with my circular saw and cut off that side of the door. Then I added edge banding on all the doors. So I did the big door, and I did the littler doors. And I could cut off the extra bits, and I've gotten better at it now. And I got hinges that work where the sides of the cabinet are flush with the frame. So I needed to put in some blocking that would allow the hinges to sit flush with the frame. On this side, I used a 2x4 that I planed down to the right thickness. And I needed to use a shim because the dimension at the top and bottom are different. On the other side, I could just use a 1/4-inch piece of plywood. While I was up here, I also added a scrap piece of plywood to cover the one wall of the cabinet that's not covered. I kind of figured everything behind the face frame and the doors doesn't really need to look that nice, so I wasn't too worried about making everything perfect. Then I can attach the hinges to the doors. And these are the style where you drill a 35mm hole, and then the hinge fits in that hole. And there are two screws that hold the hinge to the door. And the big 35mm hole gives the hinge a place to go behind the door. What's really nice about these hinges is they're adjustable in all three dimensions. You have to get them close, but once they're in place, you can sort of move the door around and get all the reveals perfect. I'm sure there's a proper way to do this, but I just do it by putting the door in place and then figuring out where the screws go and just attaching the hinges. So there's the hinge, and then there's a little plate that the hinge sits on, and the hinge and the plate come apart. So now that I have the holes marked, I can take those plates off and just attach the plate. And the plates do come in different depths. So I could have gotten something that allowed me to not have the frame and the body of the cabinet flush. I didn't really know what that was going to be, so I just got the kind that make it flush. So once it's in place, you can adjust the hinges and get the door in exactly the right location. Then I can do the other side. I decided I wanted one door bigger than the other door, so the seam in the center, or the seam sort of off-center, lines up with the cubbies below. That's why there's a big door and a little door. I tend to put in one screw per hinge and get everything in the right place, and then put the second screw in. I also screwed up a little bit. I thought I had measured these right, but they were too long and didn't come together in the middle. But I guess that's a lot better than them being too short, because that would have been a real problem. So I just had to trim one of the doors down and add the piece of edge banding back that I just cut off. Now on the big door, which went on the same way, I needed to make a stop, as there's nothing on the latch side of the door that keeps it from just swinging in too far. So I found a scrap piece of maple. I realized that my face frame was thicker than the plywood, so I needed to cut a little rabbet into my piece of maple that would allow the stop to be just a little bit closer to the door, so it will stop the door in the right location. So that rabbet fits over the face frame here. Then I can just attach that with screws, and then it closed. And there were two stops on the original doors, but they were centered up above on the shelf. So I moved those over and saved the screws and the stops. So they'll be at the new seam between the doors. That was kind of nice. And I adjusted the doors a little bit more, because they're never quite perfect. The last thing to do is to make the handles for these doors. My wife actually came up with the idea to make it a bar that runs across the bottom of the doors. And what I realized is I could recenter the doors with this handle. So the seam is off-center, but the handles will be centered on the whole cabinet. So there's sort of some centering and recentering going on. I cut a simple L shape, and I rounded over the edges. And I cut this piece to length, and I'll just attach this to the doors, and it'll make a nice pull. Put some finish on before I attach these. And I brought the doors out to the shop, and I can attach the pulls in the shop on the work table, which is much easier than trying to do it in place in the bathroom. I figured out where they're going to go and drilled the holes for the screws. I countersunk the holes on the back of the doors. Then I can clamp the pulls in place, flip the doors around again, then put the screws in from the back. And hopefully nothing's moved and everything's in the right place. And it seems to be lined up, and it looks like it'll be okay. I can take the doors back to the bathroom. And put them in. The hinges are a little harder to put back in than I'm making it out to be here. But the handles work, and they look nice. And that's how the bathroom has turned out. It now feels like an actual functioning bathroom. Thanks for watching.